Good morning. So the first thing I want to know is, can everybody hear me okay? No problem? Okay, great. My name is David Holmes, and I'm the development lead for Visual Basic for Applications. Just like it says right there. Today's session is about preparing your application for Visual Basic hosting. Basically, my one goal for this presentation is to get you thinking about how you can integrate VBA into your application. You should just think about it. The things you should take away are that it's relatively easy. You're going to want to do this because your customers are going to want you to do this. Okay, overview. I've broken the presentation down into 4 parts. The first part is I'm going to explain what is Visual Basic for Applications. And from now on, I'm just going to refer to it as VBA. Otherwise, I'm going to say Visual Basic for Applications like a million times. The second part is I'm going to describe that you're going to need an object model for your application. Without an object model, there isn't that much you can do with VBA. Object model is the core thing. You expose the functionality of your application through your object model. The third part is what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through 4 phases of integrating Visual Basic into your application, from a simple step to a more complicated. And basically, you can decide whether you want to do all the phases or some of the phases when you integrate VBA. The last part I'm going to talk about is I'm going to talk about the new features of Visual Basic 6. Visual Basic 6 is going to ship first in Office 2000, and subsequent to that, we'll be shipping the SDK, and you'll be able to take advantage of the new features in Visual Basic 6. Okay, so what is Visual Basic for Applications? Visual Basic can roughly be broken up into 3 components: an integrated development environment, a basic compiler, and a basic runtime. So what happens is you integrate VBA into your application, and you get a development environment in your application as well. And that development environment adds tools to your application. And they're tools for your users to customize your application, to add basic code, to add forms, to allow your users to leverage COM objects from within your application. So just like you heard today and tomorrow and for the rest of the week, we're really pushing people to do their business logic and expose them through COM objects. So what happens is if you use Visual Basic and you put it in your application, your end users can leverage all those COM objects that will be written, that are already written, that hopefully more will be written in the future. So features that you couldn't put in your application, that you didn't have time for, that you don't have the expertise to put in your application, your end users can create solutions and customize your applications to take advantage of all these objects. Finally, I want to point out that unlike a lot of the technology that's talked about at the PDC, VBA isn't free. We don't ship it in the OS. You can't just use it. VBA is licensed through Microsoft and through 2 sales agents currently, and both sales agents are here at the PDC, Summit Software and Mystic River Software. So you can go visit their booths. They both have booths at the trade show, and you can talk to them, and they'll give you more information about licensing VBA. Okay, so fancy slide, who's hosting VBA? If you take a look, there are probably some companies that you know, notably Vizio, Boeing, Micrographics, and as Bill mentioned in his keynote yesterday, we're very pleased to announce that Corel has licensed VBA. So now that you have a rough idea of what VBA is, I actually just want to show you what the development environment looks like. For those of you who have used the Visual Basic product itself, it'll look very familiar. Bingo. And can everybody read that? That's okay? Good. Wanted to make sure. So very similar to Visual Basic, the product. We have a project window. There's a property browser. You can write code. You can use the debugger. There's an object browser so that when your end users do leverage those COM objects, they can see all the properties and methods. I know you can't probably read that, but basically it's all the tools that are in the Visual Basic product, but this development environment is integrated into your application. There are some customizations that we do so that, for example, you can fill what is in this Project Explorer over here. I don't know if you can see that. You can, for example, in Word, they have their documents. So it's sort of a customized version of Visual Basic that's for your end users. So now that hopefully you understand a little bit about what Visual Basic is, you might be thinking, so why would I want to integrate Visual Basic? The main thing that Visual Basic gives to your users is applications programmability. What it means is that your customers want to customize your application. They want to do things that you didn't add to your app. And right when you're at the end of the programming cycle and you're doing your app and there's that one feature that your customers, they really wanted but you just didn't get to, well, if you do the right thing and if you have a powerful object model and you integrate VBA, hopefully your customers can actually drive your application to do that one feature that you couldn't add, or the feature you didn't think about that they can just do themselves. At Microsoft, we talked about something called the digital nervous system. So companies, they build a digital nervous system, and one of the main things about the digital nervous system is that you can take many different applications and use them together. And the product that allows them to be used together in a powerful way is Visual Basic for applications. You can take these different products that integrate VBA, or even some of them that don't, that have an object model, and you can combine them into a single solution and drive them with Visual Basic for applications. Finally, if your customers do take advantage of your app and it has VBA in it, and they're building this digital nervous system, what's going to happen is that they're going to spend a lot of time and a lot of money developing the solution. And once they've done that, it's pretty unlikely that they're going to change their minds and go to one of your competitors' products after they've invested all the time and the money in building up this digital nervous system using your app and other applications. So Visual Basic gives applications programmability, but so does some other products. Why VBA in particular? VBA is currently licensed by more than 100 companies. There are currently more than 50 applications that are actually shipping VBA in their product. And the most important point, actually, is that there are over 3 million developers that know BASIC. And BASIC is becoming more and more the programmability language of choice, just Visual Basic, the product, and VBA itself. So there are all these people out there that know how to program in BASIC. They prefer to program in BASIC. It's easier, it's faster. And when you integrate VBA into your application, there's already this user base that understands how to program in VBA. Okay, so that was the first point of my 4 points for the presentation. My second point is that you need an object model. So this is very important. So your application needs to be exposed as an automation object. So you need to use a light automation. You need to really think through all the functionality that your product has, and you have to think about a coherent and a logical way to expose that through a light automation. Basically, this is the most time-consuming part of VBA integration. I mean, it's the part that you really have to get right. Integrating VBA is not that difficult, but thinking through how you're going to expose all the functionality, thinking through how you're going to break down some of the parts in your application and expose it through a animation is the most time-consuming part, and it's the most important. There are no special VBA requirements for your object model. Just like there are some applications today that don't integrate VBA, but they do expose themselves through a animation that can be driven by the basic product. There's no special requirements. Some of these points are just about what you should think about when you do write your object model. You should strongly type your object model so that when the basic user is using it, you can actually have statement completion, and you can use strongly types. You should support proper object lifetime. So what this means is that when you expose a part of your application through an object model, you're going to be handing out a pointer to some object inside your app. And different than what you might be doing today, that pointer could be held onto for a long time or a short time. You have to make sure that you manage the lifetime of these objects correctly. You should be able to multicast your events so that if there are multiple outside objects driving your object model and you fire an event, they can all listen to them. You should use enumerations and collections, and you should follow the suggested naming conventions so that you're consistent with all the other applications that integrate VBA. So I just wanted to give you a quick look at an object model. So this is Microsoft Word. Pretty small. So this is statement completion what I was talking about, which is that VBA, when you strongly type your object model, when you break up your application into parts, we can look at that and we can look at the type info, look at how you describe it, and give hints to your users. So in Word, for example, they have application.active documents dot active theme, and so on and so on. So what you want to do is you want to break up your object into, or your application into different objects. Okay, so that completes the second part of my presentation, which was describing that you need an object model that's very important. So moving on to the third part is that now I'm going to describe sort of what through 4 phases, how you can start with the simplest part of VBA integration and move to a more complicated version of VBA integration. So in this phase, I'm going to discuss just initializing VBA. I'm going to discuss exposing your application's object model to VBA. Then we'll talk about how to hook VBA into your application's message loop and discuss how to show our design environment. But before I do, I just want to talk briefly about each of the 4 points. So initializing VBA is pretty self-explanatory. You're going to pass in some information. We'll take a look at some of the information that we need. Exposing your application's object model means that you're going to pass us in a pointer to the object model that represents your application. So the basic user can then write code to drive your application. Hooking the VBA into your message loop is probably, of the 4 points, the scariest. What this means is that because VBA is in a DLL and because your product owns the message loop, we need to be able to get into the message loop to do idle time processing. When we do debugging, we need to ask you to basically do something called pushing a message loop, which means that your code kind of stops as the debugger's running. And the last point, which is showing the Visual Basic Applications design environment, is pretty straightforward as well. Okay, so I think we can all read this. I stood at the back. So this is initializing VBA. So before I go through this, when I do talk about all these 4 phases, I'm basically not, my goal isn't to get you to totally understand how to integrate VBA, to be able to go back and understand everything about it, because there's a lot of rich functionality in VBA. I just want to give you a sampling of what it's like, some of the API, what you'd have to do to when you first started on your way to integrating VBA. So if you look here, there's a big structure that you have to fill in when you initialize VBA. Some of the things of note are that the section called Expose Application Object Model is where you would pass in the pointer to your object model. You pass this in also some versions of your type info, versions of the type live. Some also things of note are that VBA is localized in many languages, and you actually tell us what language you want us to display ourselves in. So if your product's in French, you would pass in for LCID user interface the LCID of the language you wanted us to have our UI be in. And so presumably it would be French in your French product. We need to have you pass in an HWin. We need to have you pass in the H instance of the process. And then eventually what you do is you pass all that information into an API that VBA exposes called VBA initialize. Now, the way it works is that we provide you with a little library that you statically link into your application, and that library exposes VBA initialize. So you call it, and we pass back the pointer, which is the second parameter to VBA initialize, which is a pointer to the IVBA object. And starting on the IVBA object and down, you basically call on multiple COM interfaces to interact with VBA. Actually, the 2 lines of code after VBA initialize is getting back something we call the component manager, which is what we use to actually hook into your application in the message loop to do some of the things that I was describing, such as idle time processing. I ask you, basically, when we put up a modal dialog, we inform you that that's happening. Okay, so hooking the message loop. So as I described, this is probably the most scary thing that happens during this phase. So this is a sample message loop. It's just a little bit. It'll keep going on subsequent slides, same code. So just like every message loop in every Windows application, you come into the message loop. Well, the first thing that happens is you call this function that we exposed called continue message loop, and you tell us whether you push the message loop or not, and we tell you if you should continue. So for example, when someone is debugging code and they actually go into break mode, so they hit a breakpoint, what we have to do is we have to stop the code from running. And what we want the user to keep using the UI, we don't want the process to just halt. So what we do is we call back on you and we ask you to please push a message loop, which means we want you to re-enter the message loop and have everything that was up to it before just basically sitting there on the stack. So when you're in a message loop, you continue to call as you go through, continue message loop, and we tell you whether you should exit that message loop or not if we were the component that actually asked you to push it. So, for example, you're in break mode and you hit the run button. So once you exit break mode, when you call this API, we're going to say we don't have to continue to push the message loop anymore. We'd like what we're doing to continue, and so you can exit this message loop. Here's some more just typical stuff. You're going to keep the message in your message loop. The section in the if statement is about basically idle time processing. We do some things at idle time, so if there are no messages in the queue, we'll ask you to please give us some processing time to do some idle things, update some UI. So now we get to the part of the message loop where you would translate the message and you dispatch the message. So what happens is before you translate or dispatch, you're going to call into us and you're going to ask us, do we want to pre-translate the message? And if we're currently the component that's active, our UI is active, or one of our forms is active, we know that, and we'll decide if we want to do something with the message or not. If we consume it, we'll return from that second parameter, yes, we consume the message. And if we indicate that we've consumed the message, you shouldn't translate or dispatch it. But if we haven't consumed the message, then you'll go in and you'll do your normal translate and dispatch code. All right, and lastly, to show the IDE is pretty simple. I mean, you have a pointer back to IVBA that you got from VBA Initialize. You query interface on IVBA for something we call a service, and you query for the its IUI element and SVBA main UI. So you get back a pointer to this interface called IUI element, and you call the show. And when you do that, it basically shows the IDE and it comes up. So I want to give you a little indication of what would actually happen if you just did this phase and you did nothing else. Alrighty. So basically, if you did all that, you would get the UI come up, you'd be able to bring up the UI. Because, which is the next phase, there's no projects yet. There's no place for your code to actually live. So if you did this first step, and you just tried it out, you gave it to your testers or whatever, essentially what you'd be able to do is go to the immediate window here, and you pass in your object model, and in the case of Excel here, their root object is called application. And you can do application.VBE. Let's do this. Just turn this on here for a sec. Now what you do is you'd be able to drive your application just through the immediate window because there's no project that can actually hold your code. But that's the first step. So what do you get after you do this phase? You can show the IDE, and you'll be able to access your application's object model from that immediate window. Not a lot. I mean, that's sort of the first phase. You get that over with, and you get on to the good stuff. And the good stuff is phase 2. And phase 2 is being able to create and persist projects. So there's actually code, basic modules in there, class modules, user forms. You can have macros run from your application. So like in Word and Excel, and I'll show you in a little bit, You can have your own macros dialog and have your users be able to run those macros and write those macros. And the last point is support for Visual Basic Project Reset, which means while you're debugging, sometimes you can get into a state where you basically don't want to keep going anymore. You're going to erase something in your hard drive or who knows. And so you're just going to hit the reset button, and you're going to stop that code from running. Okay, so creating a new project. So this is just a little function, a little sample function that creates a new project in VBA. So you have, once again, you have that pointer to the iVBA object that you got from VBA initialize. And you're going to call a function called createProject. And it takes a few parameters. The first one is the flag, which in my sample here is none. But an example of a couple of the other flags you can pass are, for example, to disable macros in this project. So for those of you familiar with Excel or Word, sometimes when you open up a document, it says, there are macros in this document. Do you want to trust it? Do you want to disable it or enable it? Well, the way that works, actually, is that when you pick disable, when they create the project, they pass in this VBA project flag disable. And what it means is you can view the code, you can edit it, but you can't run it. The second parameter is a site that we're going to call back on you to get some information. And the last parameter is the actual pointer to iVBA project that we're going to return. So we return back a pointer to iVBA project, and then you query interface it for iPersist storage, just the typical iPersist storage that everyone knows how to use. On the iPersist storage interface, you're going to call init new, just like iPersist storage, and then you're going to call one or two additional API that is on the iVBA project interface. And it's set project name, in which you're going to tell us what to call the name of the project, and it's set display name. And set display name is, and I'll show you in a minute, is that in our Project Explorer, there's the project name, and then there's a name in brackets, in parentheses after the name, and that's a name you decide what it is. It's anything you want. And then when you're done, after you've set the project name and the display name, it'll actually dirty the project, and you probably don't want it to be dirty at this point since it's a new project. So you're just going to set the dirty flag defaults. Okay, so that's creating a new project. Loading an existing project is pretty similar. You're going to get the iVBA pointer again from VBA initialize. You're going to create a project and get back a pointer to the project. You're going to query interface for iPersist storage. Then what you're going to do, which is different from the new case, is you're going to call an API called setFileName. Now what this API does is it tells us the name of the file that's associated with this project since you're loading it. What we do with the name is that in VB there's a concept of references. One project can reference another project and call that code in that other project. Well, the way references work is by file name. So when you tell us the name of the file, what can happen is your user can then reference it from another project and we'll hook up the references correctly. So you call set file name, then you call load, just like iPersist storage. We have a special API called load completed that you call when the load is finished. You set the display name again, just like the init case, and you set dirty defaults as well, because once you load it, you don't want it to still be dirty. Okay, so the next step after you have a project, it's pretty nice. Your end user is going to have to basically, bring up VBE and question. Okay, so I'm going to answer your question, and then I'm going to hopefully leave the rest of the questions for the end. So your question was, can you have more than one macro per project? Was that your question? Yeah, definitely you can. So here, I'll just show you. We'll just do a demo right now. So in Excel, you can record a macro. And I'll pick record a macro. Excel brings up this dialog. They let you pick the macro name. They let you decide in this drop-down right here where you want to put the macro. And they have a little description. So I can say, okay, I'm going to start recording. And Excel also brings up the little toolbar button that says stop recording. So I'll just type some text. I'll bold it. And I'll stop recording. So macro recording is actually a later phase that we'll talk about. So they call some APIs and they have us record this. And when you bring up the IDE, the macro is recorded in this module here. And basically, it's, once again, driving their object model. And if their object model isn't rich, then some of this recording can't be done. I mean, everything that you record has to be able to be represented in your object model. So if you look at the code, active cell formula equals what I typed in, selected equals what I typed in. The last bit, the selection, font, bold. So what they did is they translated my actions into calls into their object model, and they had VBA record it. So that's a macro in one module, but there's nothing to say that you can't insert another module, put another macro in there, whatever, and then go back to Excel, bring up Excel's macros dialog, and there's both macros are in two different modules or two different projects. It's no problem. Basically, a macro to VBA is just a function that you can call. And certainly in VB, you can have multiple functions and multiple modules and multiple projects. So we just saw the macros dialog. And now we'll talk about actually how Excel goes through and fills it with the macros that are in the basic code. So from the project, that m_p VBA project parameter, they call an API called get VBA procs. And what it's going to do is it's going to return an object that can enumerate all the procedures and routines in the project. So you return the pointer back, and you call an API called getProcs. And getProcs takes a number of flags. In this instance, it's saying it would like back a list of procedures that are only subroutines, so they take no parameters, they have no return value, and the no parameter flag. The invoke func means it wants a list of functions, not property gets or sets. The true parameters actually to sort them alphabetically when you get them back. And then it's going to return back the number of macros in the project, and it's going to return an array of the names and some other information of those macros. Then you would just loop through the number of macros, and you would fill in a dialog box or whatever with the names. And the last parameter or the last argument passed in the send dialog item message is using the return value from getProcs to set the names. Then when you're done with it, just as cleanup, you call this function called freeprocs, which basically deallocates all the memory reallocated when we pass you back the information about the procedures, and you release the interface. Now, when you actually go to run the macro, so you have a dialog now, great, the user can see them all, but they're going to want to run them. When you go to run them, there's two ways you can do it. You can either call an API called callMacro, which essentially does what it says, except it's a little unobvious that it only is used to call macros. And what we define as macros are routines that have no parameters and no return value. So typically, when you record a macro, there's no UI to specify parameters or return value. It just doesn't work. And so we have a specific API that makes it easy just to call those kind of routines. And as you can see, it's pretty straightforward. The middle line of code is basically all you really need. And it's, you get from the VBA procs that you got back in our previous example, you just call macro with the name, and it'll just execute that code. So when you have your macro dialog up, and someone clicks run, you just call macro, and it'll run that code. The little gotcha, though, is that right after that, call macro can return a special H result. And what that H result is reset. So while your macro is running, it hits a breakpoint, or you get a runtime error. And we have to actually stop the code. Well, when we stop the code, it means all the code stopped. So if there was code running before this, and you were at a breakpoint, and then the user went back to your application and ran another macro, well, the first one was still, sort of stopped. And that second macro, something happens that causes a reset. Well, we have to get all that code off the stack. We can't continue sort of once a reset occurs, because who knows what's happened. The global variables are gone, or whatever. And so if we return reset from call macro, it means that you have to start the process of asking us to reset. And part of that is potentially asking us to have you pop message loops off the message queue, because we have to get right down to the bottom. Now the second way, the more complicated way to call a routine, is through an API called bindProcDisp. Excuse me for a sec. Bind proc disp is actually short form for bind procedure dispatch. So the way bind proc disp works, it's very similar to what it is invoke, basically, iDispatch invoke. So if you take a look from the iVBA procs interface, you can call bind proc disp. You can pass in the name of the procedure. You can ask for whether you want it to be a property as opposed to a method. And we'll return back the iDispatch, the disp ID, and the invoke guide for that particular method or property. Then what you do is you have to, the second line after that, which isn't obvious, is that you have to call set mode. We have, in VBA, we have a concept of design mode and use mode. And for people that have used Word or Excel, design mode is the mode where you put a control on the form. It's sort of like, it's the mode where you're designing your document and you potentially don't want code to run while you're doing it. So when you're in design mode, events don't fire, for example. So while you're dragging and dropping controls, you don't want sort of events, focus events to fire all over the place. And so your end user can, in Word and Excel at least, control whether you're in design mode or use mode. So when you go to run a macro through bind proc disp, you have to call set mode, use, whereas in call macro, we actually do that internally. So once you put us into use mode, so code can actually run, then you call invoke on the iDispatch that we pass back. So in this case, because it is just invoke, it can have parameters, so you can pass in parameters to it. It can have a return value. And so bind proc disp is more powerful than call macro, but it's also more complicated. And as you can see with the second slide of stuff to do with the return value, it is more complicated. So after phase 2, you've gotten pretty far. Your end users can create and persist VBA projects. They can use class modules, they can use standard modules, they can use our forms package inside of a project, and they can run and they can debug macros that manipulate your application's object model. Now I was going to give a little demo of that, but since we've seen it, I'll just quickly step through it. So like I was showing you before, you can create a document in Excel, you can add code, it comes up in the macros dialog. You can record macros, and you can play them back. So why don't we see if the beep one will actually let's change it to message box. I'm not sure if the machine can actually beep up here. Okay, tool, macros. Ooh, yay. So it's pretty easy. Once you get this far, your application is pretty powerful, and your end user can do a lot of different things. One of the things, though, that can't be done is, if you look in here, I'm not sure if you can see it, right here there's 3 different objects, 4 actually in total, that represent the workbook and the sheets in the workbook. And to actually get them to show up and to be able to define individual objects in the project that can be referenced by name as opposed to through your object model, you have to add them. And that's phase 3. And phase 3 is adding single instance host specific objects, which we like to call documents, to your project. And when you do that, you can also coordinate the selection state of the documents. What that means is that when you're in your application space and VBE's up and your application's up, VBE has a property browser. And it can browse all the properties of objects in VBE. Well, because you've added your object to the project, when you select around in your application space, our property browser can be updated to be viewing the properties of the objects in your application. And so your user can use our property browser to set properties on your stuff and look at what the current values are. Back there for a second. So that's what I just did. Okay, so when you add one of these single instance host objects, a couple things to note are that it is single instance. So different from a class, it's basically you can't create a new one of these. You can't type in basic code that says new sheet 1. These things, there's one instance and one instance only, and these instances live for as long as you want them to. The way the instances work, are that there are three parts to it. And you provide two of them, and we actually add a third. You provide the outer object, called the CEO, the controlling extensible object, and the EO, the inside one, and we provide the VBA extension. And the reason this happens is because what you can do is when you add your object to our project, your end user can actually add code behind your object to extend the methods and properties on it. So in Excel, if you have a sheet doesn't have a method called foo by default. But your end user can add foo, a method or property called foo, and then from outside of Excel, when that project is loaded, if Word, for example, is driving Excel, if Word gets a hold of that object, to Word, that object contains a method called foo, even though when the designers of Excel, the developers of Microsoft, wrote it, it didn't have a method called foo. And this is one way where your users, the users of Excel, the users of your applications, can customize some of your objects and make them look the way they like. So the reason we have this three-level sort of wrapping is because you're going to hand out a pointer to your object, and you're going to hand out a pointer to the CEO. And the CEO is going to delegate all calls to the VBA extension, and the VBA extension is going to decide whether a call is onto one of the extended methods or a call onto one of your base methods. And if it's a call on the base, we're going to call into the EO and have you guys do whatever you have to do with that method. But if it's an extended method or property, then we're going to take care of it ourselves and execute the basic code for it. So once you have given us these objects, one of the features that you can do is have selection within your application tracked, and like I said, have the properties and methods visible in the property browser. So this is just a brief look at what the API looks like to do the selection tracking. There are three methods. Basically, you tell us the number of objects that are contained on the document. So if you have multiple controls on the document, it'd be the document and all the controls. And we're going to ask you for all the I dispatches for these objects. And then in our property browser, there's a drop-down at the top, and it lists all the controls and basically everything you give us through our dispatch. And your end user can then just select which one they want, change the properties. We'll call back on you through that I dispatch, and you can update those properties. So after phase 3, your user can use documents. They can add methods and properties to them. They can easily write code to handle the events. One of the big advantages to actually adding documents to your project is that when, I'm going to show you. In a sheet, for example, I'll bring up the code module for a sheet, and I'll click on here. So the sheet has a bunch of events, and this one we see here is the selection changed event. Is that when you actually define an object, a document for us, we can query that document for the events on it, and we can have them appear in the dropdowns, so that the end user doesn't have to navigate through your object model, try to figure out what the events are for this object, try to hook it up with some basic syntax. It just appears in the dropdowns, and it's very easy for them to get to and to sort of see what events are on your objects. Like I was mentioning, if you use the selection stuff, you can browse the document properties. And the last point, can directly access documents, means that because you've added a document to the project namespace, you can just refer to the document by name. So in code, you can just type sheet 1, and that's fine. If you didn't add it, you would have to do application dot and go through your object model to find the sheet that you wanted to work with. So adding a document adds them as sort of a first glance name in the namespace so that you can directly just use them without going through the object model. The final phase that I'm going to talk about is macro recording. So macro recording is very powerful, but it's also something that you have to give a lot of thought to. Basically, we have a set of APIs you can call that we pump code into a code module, and later on your end users can call that code. So what you're going to want to do is add some macro recording UI to your application, some play buttons, stop, pause. Well, then when they record, you'll generate some lines of basic code that map to each of the recorded UI actions. So this is where it's really important that your object model closely maps to the functionality in your application. And You're going to utilize your application's object model in the recorded basic code. And one good thing is that because you're giving us the code, you can optimize it. So if the user does some action and your app is intelligent enough to realize that you can use a for loop in there instead of recording 100 lines of code, you can certainly do that and give us that code, and that will be played back. So this is the macro recording API. I'm not going to actually show an example of calling it in code here in my slides, but just to go through them, there's record start, where you give us a project and you basically give us an item you want to record into, so a module, and you give us the name of the macro that you want to have the code recorded into. And what we'll do is, if we have to, we'll create a new module. You don't give us a name, we'll pick a name, and recording will start. Then you'll call record line, and you pass us in a line of basic code. And typically that code is some form of application dot something or sheet one dot. Begin action and erase action are used for undo. So you can say, I'm starting an action now, and then you can say, well, I want to erase that action, which means you can undo up to the point you began the action. You can cancel recording, which means we'll just stop, we'll undo all the code, and you can finish recording. A couple of the other APIs you'll use off and on. One's about get keyword. Basically, we provide you with a list of defines of basic keywords, so you don't have to hard code if you want to use a for loop or a while loop. And then it returns back the string that describes that particular language construct. We can tell you if something that you're using is a valid identifier so that it doesn't conflict with something else that's in the project. And you can get back the current name of the macro you're recording. So I was going to demo macro recording, but we've already seen it, so I won't. So at the end of phase 4, pretty much you've got all of the features, or many of the features that are in the Office products that integrate VBA. You can record macros, and you can undo parts of the recording session or cancel the whole thing. All right, so all the code that I've showed you is talking to VBA directly through the APIs that are sort of at the lowest level, but there are some alternatives to how you can integrate VBA. So the thing I described was the first bullet point, which is the native COM interfaces. But there's also, for some people that use MFC, it can be a little bit difficult or a little bit awkward for them to call directly. And there are a set of MFC wrapper classes so that your MFC application can talk to our interfaces more easily. As well, there's an automation wrapper so that if your application is written in Visual Basic, so your application is actually a VB app, and your VB app wants to integrate VBA, there's a set of automation wrappers that makes it easy for you to call VBA through them as well. Okay, so everything I talked about was VBA 5. That's the current version of VBA that ships in Office 97 that is licensed by all the companies that I showed you earlier. But coming soon in Office 2000 is VBA 6. And I just wanted to briefly talk about some of the features of VBA 6 that are new. So one of the big features, actually, is that in the previous version of VBA, because we shipped earlier than Visual Basic 5, we didn't have all of the language features that VB5 did. But now that we shipped, now that VB5 shipped, or VB6 shipped earlier than we did, we have all the same language features. We have language parity. Everything that you can do construct in VB6, you can do in VBA 6. Also, because Office 2000 and because it's an important thing, VBA actually supports the Windows installer, of which there are talks at the PDC this week. So what this means is that, hi, bye. See, they're just testing me. It's just messing with my mind. So just like we're encouraging everybody to use the Windows installer in their applications, and you saw the cool little demo with deleting all the DLLs and they all came back, VBA has all those features as well. So if your application uses Darwin, which is the Windows installer, VBA will do the same thing. And so we'll fix ourselves up if some of our files are gone. We'll be able to run from the CD. We'll be able to run from the network. All the cool stuff that the Windows installer does. We've also added something called multi-instance host objects. So as I described a sheet, there's only one sheet. You can't create a new sheet. There's only one there in the project. Multi-instance host objects are objects that you give us a definition for, similar to a sheet, except in basic code you can create instances of them. They're a class that you define that you can add code behind, just like a sheet, but you can create multiple instances of them. We've added digital signing to VBA projects, so we work with your application your application actually stores the signature wherever you want, but we'll use signing. Well, basically what we do is, in a VBA project, there's two things. There's compiled code and there's source code, and they're both stored in our storage so that when you go to edit the code, you can get to the source code. But also, for optimum performance, we'll run from the compiled code when we actually just run the code. We sign both of them. So we sign the compiled code and we sign the source code. So that way, if someone gets in there, some hacker or something, and changes either the source or the binary, next time that gets loaded up, we'll give them a warning saying that this has been altered. Or even if it hasn't been altered, this person signed it, you trust them, it's not signed. We had a big request, which we didn't have in VBA 5, for modeless forms. So there's a forms package in VBA, and in the previous version, you couldn't have modeless forms with the forms package, but now you can. We've added the ability for, because it's a big deal for many applications that they want to have add-ins to their application, we've added some helper routines and some dialogue, some UI, so that you can have add-ins in your application, and we'll bring up the dialogue, we'll manage looking in the registry and that kind of stuff. You have to pass us some information. It's not for free, but we try to help you along so you can have add-ins in your application. And there's a lot of other things. For example, there are add-ins in VBE itself now, so you can add an add-in into the Visual Basic environment and drive it. All right, call to action. So first thing is expose your application as an automation object. You have to think about exposing basically all your functionality in a logical way. Then you should go out and license and integrate VBA into your application. Let your users customize your application, give them the power to combine your application with other people's products and create custom solutions, and empower the 3.2 million developers to customize and integrate your app to meet their specific needs. So for more information, you can look at these three websites. You can look at the Microsoft website for VBA. You can look at the Summit Software website, which is one of the licensing agents. And you look at the Mystic River website, which is also a licensing agent. Okay, so I can take questions now for 15 minutes. Let me get a drink first. Okay. Well, VB Script is free. Oh, the engine, not the agent. No, the engine is different. It's totally different. VB Script. So the question was, is the VB Script engine and the VBA language engine the same engine? Historically, the VB Script engine was written from the same code base as the VBA engine, but that was a fairly long time ago, and they've diverged. And so they have different features. They've added some things to the VBScript engine to try to make it sort of at the same level as the JScript engine. So it's not the same engine at all. It's a different DLL, but it's very similar in the sense that all the language constructs you use are upwards compatible. So if you have VBScript code, you should be able to take it and plug it into VBA and modify it a bit to work with whatever application you're currently in. But pretty much it should be drag and drop, but it is a different implementation. So currently today, so the question is it possible to put the individual project items in a VBA project under source code control? The way I would answer that question is, honestly, it's pretty difficult. Because we ask you to, or we persist our individual items in a binary storage, the most reasonable way for you to actually put it under source code control would be to extract the text from a module and store it out in, you can also export it into a module, like a .bas file or a .cls file, and then you put those under source code control. But, for example, you can't, for the document case, like a sheet, there's some binary information that Excel has there about their sheet, and we can't, there's no textual, unless it had some textual representation, we can't do much about it. So my answer is that it's difficult, but you could do it if you really wanted to. So the question is, because the object model is so important, are there any references to help you out in thinking about how you'd want to design your object model? Definitely a sort of a high-level description is in the all animation reference guides, but as for specific things, I'm pretty sure there are books about it. I just don't have anything particular I can refer you to, but I can definitely find out, and I can post it up to a website and we'll let you know. It's on MSDN? Okay, so if you want to take a look at that, you can go to either the Mystic River or Summit websites, and there should be links to some presentations about that. So you mean, so the question is, can you restrict language constructs from your application? So by that question, I presume you mean you don't want the end user to be able to call a particular. So, right, so you can disable certain language functionality. Is there something particular? So the answer is you can't, but I'm just curious about what you would want to disable. Right, so his comments were that if you had integrated VBA on an Intel platform and your end user wrote some basic code and they used a construct and you wanted to sort of convert that code into some other language on a different platform, it'd be difficult to do if they used a construct you couldn't convert. But yeah, so the answer is no, you can't limit what they type in. Uh-huh. So the question is, essentially the question is, can you localize your object model? Um, I'm sorry? Well, not a long time ago, in Excel 5, so I don't know when that would be, 5 years ago, um, the object models were localized. But we don't recommend object models being localized anymore because just like the language, it's not a document. I mean, the object model is a programming, it's the constructs. We usually suggest that you do it in one language and you don't actually try to do it in multiple languages because for one thing, it's hard for other people to read, it's hard. They're just a problem. So you could try to do it. I mean, VBA doesn't do anything in particular to limit you from doing that, but we don't recommend it. Right, so we have, well, it kind of varies. Sure. The question is, how extensible is the IDE, the Visual Basic IDE, and are there events that call back to let you know what's going on? The IDE is extensible. We have basically a subset of the Visual Basic extensibility model for our IDE. Also, there are methods that we call back and tell you, for example, when a module is changed or when something's been selected. For the most part, you'll get the most notification about things that change in the menu structure. So when you select something or when that changes. The set of events that we have for actually changing code, for like keystrokes and that kind of things, is fairly limited. I mean, you will get a little bit, but it's not as extensive as we would like, and hopefully in the next version it'll be better. So well, you can definitely drive us. Like you can tell us insert a module, highlight this line of code, replace this with this. Right. So the comment here is actually a request we've had that we haven't got around to yet. And it's when you're doing IntelliSense, if you, for example, do IntelliSense on an item that we don't know anything about or it's dynamic and the host wants to actually do drop down the list and fill in what the items are, do we provide that functionality? And it is on our feature list, but it isn't currently in VBA today. So you can definitely, well, you don't have UI, but and you wouldn't want us. So the question is, they have middle tier application that doesn't have UI currently. You can definitely integrate this if you don't have any UI. The question would be, would it be bad for your users if they brought up the VBE environment and wrote code in it? Right, okay, so that's a very good point. So the way it would probably work is that you would have an app that would be sort of the development app that integrates VBA for development time. And your users would use that, they'd write the code, they'd save out their project wherever you told us to do. And then you can have a second app which has no UI, which you can just load the code into and run it. And what you would have to do is if, when we hit a runtime error or a breakpoint, we call you back before we actually try to show the IDE and stop. And you can tell us not to go into break mode. You can tell us to stop running that code. Don't show the IDE. So you can definitely use this without having our IDE up. The only question is, how does the user author their code? And I would think that it might be a separate app in your case.
That's very interesting. How hard would it be to, how hard is that to, in your client side, develop your script so you run it GUI and then pass that code out? You run from a middle tier component, an MTS component, and also in the script that you generate that natively integrate with MTS.
Okay, so the question is, well, really the question is, how does VBA play with MTS? So currently today there is no, we don't have a project item that's sort of like build an MTS object out of basic code. If you yourselves author MTS objects, there's no reason you couldn't integrate VBA into that object. And so your MTS object understands how to load a project up and run the code. The problem would be that today VBA isn't multi-threaded, and so if you did that, you would probably lose some of the benefit of your object being able to run on multiple threads and stuff. We're definitely thinking about MTS, and for the next version of the version of VBA 6 that I was giving a preview of, we're thinking about some new things to do to try to make things a little bit more thread aware and to try to integrate a little bit better with objects that are MTS objects. But I think because of the threading issue, currently the current version of VBA would be difficult to put in an MTS object. Okay? Mm-hmm. So the question is, when I did the macro recording demo, there were some dialogues that came up. I'd like to pick the name, and there was a stop button, a play button. All those UI is brought up by Excel. So the host totally just describes what they want to do. They can do it all on their own. And you just call us through that set of API that I described at the end. So it's up to you to display your UI. Right. The question is, how would you actually implement macro recording? Yeah, so the way it would work would be, you would know you're in recording mode because your UI put you in recording mode. Then, depending on how deep recording is into your app, like if it's a sort of every action or a couple actions, what you would do is, all throughout your code, you'd have to be able to look and see, I'm in recording mode now. I just did, I changed this character to bold. So now I have to generate a line of basic code and pump it into the module. So you'd have to generate, you know your object called application, you know there's document, there's set equals bold, and you would actually have to generate that line of code and pass it into us. Do you mean could? Oh, sure. Well, I mean, yeah. So if you did something, if your user just did some action, nothing's going to happen. It's not going to put some magically put code in there. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'd have to, I'm going to kind of guess, because I'm trying to think of what the code would look like. Probably what would happen is if you didn't start recording, oh, I'm sorry, the question is record line smart enough to not, to do the right thing if you're in recording mode, so you don't have to have checks all throughout your application. I'm going to guess that if you call record line and you haven't called start recording, we're going to return the error code. Back? Yep. So I think the question is, if once you've added an object to the project, can you remove an object? Well, you can definitely add, like in Excel, you could definitely add sheets, and you could, the host can remove the sheet and put it back. Of course, any code that's written will probably not run anymore if it's referring to that sheet and you've deleted it. But yeah, I mean, you can dynamically add and remove project items at will. So the question is, what kind of support is there in the VBA development environment for modifying things that are not on VBA subforms? So your application is actually written in VB. So the property browser, the thing that displays all the properties, if you pass this, you can pass this any iDispatch from anywhere. It doesn't have to be a project item in our project. It doesn't have to be even in the process. I mean, as long as we can call through the iDispatch, we'll be able to browse the properties and set them. But basically, off the top of my head, that's about the most powerful thing you could probably do with that basic form. You couldn't, like for example, you couldn't have the code module for that thing appear in VBA and be able to set events or anything on it. No, you couldn't. The question is, do you have to have a dual interface to use VBA? You don't have to have a dual interface, but it has to at least be an iDispatch interface. The benefit, though, if you have a dual, is that we can early bind to the interfaces, and so instead of calling through invoke, we can call right through the vtable, and so things would be faster, but you don't have to do that. Yes, so you can use our extensibility to insert code modules. You can insert just lines of text into there, and probably do as much as you'd want to do without actually doing recording of stuff. Yeah, the recording macro thing is more to facilitate. It's sort of like you're recording, you're undoing actions, but yeah, you can sort of just on the fly just sort of modify those code. Right. So currently today, obviously VBA. I'm sorry. The question is, what's the future of VBA and how would it fit into DNA with the thin client, rich client, middle tier objects? So of course, VBA today is great for rich clients. So you have a big app on a client, and you're going to customize it with VBA. In the future, we certainly hope and we have plans to try to get VBA into the middle tier. So just kind of like the question about MTS, where you have business logic on your middle tier, will be great for people to be able to customize that logic. And we're certainly looking at how VBA fits in there and sort of how we have to change our tools to be able to debug in that environment and author that and customize that logic. So that's where I would say VBA is heading, is to the middle tier, to customizing business rules, and it's always going to stay on the rich client because that'll always be needed. And we're still also thinking about how it might even play on the third part, which is the database end, but we're still thinking about that. Okay. So I'm not the best person to talk about the licensing stuff. Oh, the question is licensing and what happens if you license VBA 5 and then VBA 6 comes out? Do you have to go through hoops to get VBA 6? Do you just get it for free? Um, yes, yeah, definitely. I mean, we're not going to make it difficult for you to upgrade to VBA 6 at all. It shouldn't be very difficult. I'm not quite sure if you have to sign another form or something, but it shouldn't be too hard. Okay. So the question is, do we expose any internal VBA debugging information like the current line that's stopped or the, the, the values of all the variables? Is that what you mean? So no, we do not. So the question is, can you produce independent executables that run outside of the host application? In VBA 5 you cannot. It always because, and actually, the reason that you can't is because VBA is targeting your host. I mean, it's driving your host object model. So if your host isn't there, it's not really driving anything. The question is there an interface to allow you to add local variables or global variables? There is no specific interface that's like add global. There is just, as I described, there's just, add line. And you can add any line you want. So you can add lines of code that add global variables or local variables. No, not at runtime. You can do that at runtime. Yeah, because VBA is integrated in your host, and because it doesn't build an executable that runs outside of VBA, our whole design environment is there. So if you decide at runtime, like you load up your app, it runs the project, and you decide that something happens in your app and you want to insert a code module, like right in the middle of running this code, put lines in it, and then run that, you can go ahead. The only penalty you'll get is that you'll have to initialize our whole IDE because what you're really doing is literally driving our design environment. So it can be hidden and everything. It's just it's a performance penalty because you're going to have to initialize that part of us. Well, okay, so the question is, can you drive the project without getting the IDE involved? When you drive us through our extensibility to do things like that, it's kind of, the IDE is involved in a sense. I mean, what happens is you're going to call us just through API. The IDE is not going to come up or anything. But as part of just calling that API, we need to initialize certain parts of our IDE. So yeah, you're not driving, you're not watching the IDE move or anything. It's just we need to initialize that code. Right. Right. So the question is, can you dynamically change your object model while VBA is running, load with the project, whatever? The answer is no. That is a feature request that people have had. In VBA 6, the feature that I've described, which is the multi-instancing host object thing, you can actually dynamically change those. So if you describe a part of your object model, a form or a sheet, through that, and it makes sense for that thing to be instanceable, create instances of it, then you can actually change that dynamically on the fly. But currently, in VBA 5, you can't do that at all because that's a new feature. And in VBA 6, that's the only part that you can currently dynamically change. Just keep going, finish. Okay, so one more. Back. Oh, you owe me a beer. Right. So the question is, what's the size of the files, and if you had a runtime piece and a design time piece, would there be a difference? Currently today, in 5 and in 6, there's only one main DLL. So the design time's in both. The design time and the runtime is in one DLL, and we optimize the DLL so that at runtime we don't load in the bits that we don't need, but you need to install the whole DLL purely for the reason that, there are some apps, as we've seen questions today, that they want to drive the IDE part at design time, or at runtime, and also they want to be able to debug and stuff, so they want to have the IDE come up. The actual VBE DLL, it's called VBE 6.DLL, is, I think it's about, it's like I look at the debug version all the time, so I'm trying to think what the retail version is. I think it's about 2 meg. It's fairly big. I mean, it's got the whole IDE and stuff in it. But it's also, depending on sort of what your application is, it could very well already be there. So, if you run on a typical user's machine, they have Office, then that DLL is there already. It doesn't cost you anything, so it's already on the machine. And with all the other applications that are using VBE, it's more than likely on the machine already. Yes. Well, the question is, can you sync events through iConnection point? Right. Can your end user write an event handler? The answer is yes. Just like in VB, there's a syntax called with events. And so you insert a class module, you say dim x with events, some class name. What will happen is in the drop-downs for that class module, you'll see the object now with all the events. You can write your code in the events, and they'll fire. Okay, so I'm going to be at the Ask the Experts thing tonight. So if you have more questions, you can certainly come and talk to me.